Rain tapped against the window of the small bookstore on Charles Street with the soft insistence of memories trying to return. Not suddenly, but like ghosts easing their way into the present. The street outside was slick with light and silence, and though Boston had survived the war without bombed buildings or rationed silence, the city, like its people, carried the quiet heaviness of what had been lost. Alexandra, now 40 years old, kept her hair tightly pinned and her voice measured as if even casual conversation might stir something she'd worked too long to bury. After the war, she found herself in Boston, far from her native Poland, rebuilding her life in the corners of bookstores and behind stacks of literature that reminded her of who she used to be. The shop was modest, tucked between a tailor and a flower stand, but to her it was a cathedral of paper and memory. She never married. She rarely spoke about the war, but in the bottom drawer of the counter, beneath invoices and ink-stained ledgers, she kept a small, empty glass bottle, a Cologne bottle, the kind with a fine metal spray and French words etched across the label. The scent was long gone, but Alexandra could summon it at will, citrusy, warm, laced with something that reminded her of wind through cedar trees and old books. It had belonged to Dawid, a Polish literature student she had loved in secret back in Warsaw, before everything, before the Nazis came, before the ghetto walls rose, before he disappeared without a trace. She had held onto that bottle like a relic, not just of love, but of who she had been, a girl brave enough to love a Jewish boy, foolish enough to believe the world might not tear them apart. When he vanished, she assumed he was gone forever. Some fates were too obvious to question. Then, one afternoon in early spring, a man walked into the store. He wore a long coat, his hair grayer than black now, his hands the kind of hands that had held too much and learned to let go. She almost didn't look up until he passed by her on his way to the poetry section, and the air shifted. It wasn't his face that stopped her, it was the scent, faint, familiar, devastating. It couldn't be, and yet it was. She froze, heart pounding, breath shallow, fingers clutched around the edge of the counter as if the world had tilted. The bottle in the drawer hadn't released that scent in years, and yet it hovered around him like memory, like something trying to speak. She didn't say a word, but when he picked up a book of Polish verse and began to read, she knew. And now, get ready, because what happens next changes everything. That night, Alexandra didn't sleep. Not out of fear, but because some memories don't knock. They arrive fully formed, sit at the edge of your bed, and demand to be remembered. She lay still beneath her worn quilt, the soft tick of the old mantel clock in her Beacon Hill apartment, marking time like a metronome for a heart that refused to slow down. Her fingers kept tracing the edges of the drawer where she kept the bottle. Empty, yes, but suddenly more potent than ever, its memory reborn in a single impossible moment. She told herself it had to be coincidence. The cologne, that specific blend of citrus and wood, bright and intimate, was rare, yes, but not exclusive. Perhaps some company had revived the formula. Perhaps she was simply tired, too worn down by the routine of quiet days and quieter evenings to trust her senses. But then again, what were the odds? He had come in like any other customer, barely noticeable, unassuming in his heavy coat and quiet gait. And yet, the moment he walked past her, the air shifted, not like wind, but like a page, turning in a book you'd long left unfinished. The scent trailed behind him, not like perfume, but like memory, and she had nearly dropped the stack of receipts in her hand. The next day, she arrived at the bookstore early. She didn't know why, perhaps to convince herself she'd imagined it. But when the bells above the door chimed, that soft, familiar sound that always felt like a pause in the world, and he stepped inside again, Alexandra stopped breathing. He walked past her again as if browsing were his true purpose. This time, he moved to the shelves of American poetry, then drifted toward the translations. His fingers traced the spines with a kind of reverence that made her stomach twist. And again, The scent. She didn't speak to him. Couldn't. Her voice felt trapped somewhere deep beneath years of silence and unresolved grief. But something inside her stirred. Not recognition, not certainty, but a flame, small, trembling, alive. The third day, she rearranged the poetry shelf. Not all of it, just a few selections. Polish poets, one by Tuwim, his favorite, one by Leszmian. She left a slim volume just slightly askew, as if by accident, as if a customer had leafed through it and forgotten to put it back properly. When he returned, and of course he did, he paused by that very shelf. He didn't pick up the book at first. His hand hovered near it. Then slowly he reached out, turned a few pages, and stopped. Alexandra watched from behind the counter, her heart thudding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. He stayed there for a while, reading or remembering or both. She couldn't see his face clearly, but the tension in his shoulders softened. He turned one more page, then closed the book and slid it back gently, almost reverently, as though it belonged to someone he'd once known well. She felt dizzy. She tried to rationalize it, tried to find logical explanations for his presence, for the scent, for his attention to Polish verse in a quiet bookstore in Boston in 1950. But logic failed in the face of memory. And the heart has its own language, one that doesn't rely on proof. She began to anticipate his visits, not with impatience, but with a quiet ache. Each time he entered the shop, it was as though a lost part of her had been temporarily restored. Not fully, not openly, but something inside her shifted, from numb to alert, from settled to waiting. Still, she said nothing. Some days he would read for an hour, his posture relaxed, his brow furrowed as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. Other times he'd simply pass through, pick up a single book, and leave without a word. But always, there was the scent, faint, persistent, personal. On the fifth day he lingered by the counter, not close, just near enough for her to notice the way his hand curled around the corner of a hardcover, the way he glanced, briefly, at the copy of Tuwim she'd left visible again. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But something passed between them. And that night, for the first time in years, Alexandra took the old Cologne bottle from the drawer, placed it on her windowsill, and left it there, uncapped, as if to say, "I haven't forgotten." By the end of the week, Alexandra had come to accept that she could no longer stand behind the counter, pretending not to know what her body already believed. It wasn't just the scent that lingered, subtle, precise, devastating, but the way he turned the pages of books, slowly, reverently, as if language itself were a fragile relic, and how his gaze moved not like a stranger's, but like someone walking through a dream he was trying not to wake from. She had watched him return each day, watched him step through the narrow doorway with the same quiet presence, watched his fingers trace the edges of Polish and French poetry, his eyes stopping, briefly, deliberately, on names that used to mean everything. And though neither of them had spoken beyond the simple nod of acknowledgement or the murmured thank you as he passed the counter, there was something else that passed between them. Something wordless, persistent, breathing in the silence. So on that seventh morning, Alexandra arrived earlier than usual, opened the shop alone, and walked to the shelf that held the few remaining Polish volumes, many of them untouched, some misshelved, some forgotten, and selected a slim, dog-eared copy of Julian Tuwim's collected poems. The same poet Dawid had once read to her, not out of performance, but out of devotion, as if every verse were a secret between them. She placed the book gently on the counter near the register and opened it to a page she remembered by heart, folding the corner softly as if worn from time, even though the fold was brand new. The poem was one they had whispered once in the middle of a winter evening in Warsaw, The electricity out, the air so still she could hear his breath between the stanzas. The doorbell jingled shortly before noon. He entered as always, coat slightly too large for his frame, hat in hand, eyes scanning the room not in search of a specific title, but as if looking for a familiar shape in a landscape that had changed too many times. This time, however, he didn't go directly to the shelves. He walked toward the counter slowly, pausing halfway, as if unsure whether to continue or turn back. Alexandra kept her eyes on the book, not looking at him. Not yet, her hands steady, despite the quickening in her chest. He noticed the book. He stood before it, reached out, and touched the page with fingers that trembled not from age, but from recognition, as if the words had spoken his name after all this time. He didn't lift the volume. He didn't speak. He simply stared at the verse, his thumb grazing the folded corner as if trying to remember how it had once felt to read aloud in the dark. Alexandra cleared her throat, softly, almost involuntarily, and then, in a voice that barely reached him, said, "Not many remember Tuwim in this country." He looked up, eyes slow to focus, as though pulled from a place he hadn't expected to return to. He said nothing, but his expression, that quiet undoing in the space between tension and release, was answer enough. She waited, then added gently, "I used to know someone who recited this one from memory. He would speak it like it was prayer." The man blinked, not startled, not confused, but as if the sentence had broken something long sealed shut. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, his movements deliberate, cautious, like someone handling a fragile object too precious to rush, and withdrew a square of faded fabric, folded perfectly, as though untouched since the day it was first pressed. He placed it on the counter without a word, unfolded it slowly, and turned it so the monogram faced her. A.N. He hand-stitched in deep blue thread. Alexandra stared at it, her lips slightly parted, the rest of the room dissolving into stillness, into colorless light, into memory. She had sewn that handkerchief herself in 1943, from a scrap of linen her father hadn't noticed was missing, a gift for Dawid before the night he told her he might try to escape. She had pressed it into his hand and whispered, "Come back with this," and then pretended not to hear her own voice break. Now it lay there, between them. She didn't ask how he'd kept it. She didn't ask if it was truly him. She didn't need to. Because recognition isn't always about names or faces. Sometimes it's the scent, the gesture, the fact that someone remembers your favorite line of a forgotten poem, or carries your handkerchief like a talisman through the end of the world. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and in that shared gaze was the weight of everything that hadn't been said. The years lost, the questions never answered, the longing that had endured not in letters, but in silence. "You survived," she whispered. He nodded once. She smiled, not with joy, but with relief, because whatever he had become, and whatever she had turned into in the years since, this moment was enough. They didn't hug, they didn't touch, they didn't plan. But for the first time since Warsaw, Alexandra knew she had been found. He returned the next day, just as she had hoped he would, though Alexandra had told herself that hope was no longer something she allowed. And when the bell above the bookstore door rang and he stepped inside, she looked up from her ledger, not with surprise, but with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had waited so long for a miracle that its arrival felt, paradoxically, inevitable. They didn't speak right away. She simply closed the book in front of her, pushed her chair back, and walked out from behind the counter as he stood by the poetry shelf, the same one that had borne witness to so many of their silences. She stopped a foot away from him, and after a long breath asked, "Would you like to take a walk?" He nodded, without hesitation, and followed her outside, where the afternoon light poured through the branches of bare trees and painted their shadows along the brick sidewalks of Beacon Hill. The street smelled faintly of rain and distant wood smoke, and the soft hum of the city seemed to recede as they walked. Not quickly, not aimlessly, but with the kind of shared pace that comes from knowing there's no reason to rush when what matters most has already waited decades. They walked without speaking for several blocks, past the library where students sat curled against the windows with books, past the alley where a violinist sometimes played Chopin on weekends, and finally into the public garden, where Alexandra led him to a quiet bench beneath an oak that had long since lost its leaves. She sat first, placing her hands on her lap, and turned slightly toward him, unsure of how to begin. But it was Dawid who spoke first. "I was arrested in '44 near the Vistula," he said, his voice low, even, without apology or drama. "A stranger recognized me. I'd been using forged documents, moving between safe houses, reading poems to children in exchange for bread. I thought I could make it another week. I was wrong." She didn't interrupt. "They sent me to Mauthausen," he continued, eyes not on her, but on the pond beyond the trees. "Then to Gusen. I stopped counting the days. My name became a number. My memories became dangerous, so I buried them." Alexandra's throat tightened, but still she said nothing, knowing the gift wasn't just his presence, but the words he was giving her now. Words he'd likely never spoken aloud, not even in France, where he'd been living under a different name, in a different life. "I survived," he said simply, "and for years I didn't ask why. I worked in an antiquarian bookshop outside Lyon, catalogued lost volumes, wrote nothing, said little, but every time I held a book of poetry in my hands, I thought of you." She looked at him now fully, seeing not just the man he had become, but the boy she had loved, softened by time, marked by grief, but still Dawid. "I waited," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "until 1946. I waited through victory parades and Reconstruction. I checked passenger lists, hospital registries, the Polish Red Cross. I came here thinking maybe I could forget, or maybe I could rebuild something." He turned to her now, and for the first time there was no caution in his gaze, only sadness and something else, gratitude. "I never married," he said. "Neither did I," she replied. They sat in silence again, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence had always been their language. Even back then, when the world demanded secrecy, it felt natural to fall into that rhythm again, to walk not side by side as strangers or lovers, but as people who had once made each other whole, and now were learning how to carry each other gently again. As they made their way back through the city, they paused by storefronts that had changed names but kept the same windows, by churches that still rang their bells at the hour, by the little shop that sold imported paper, where Alexandra still bought the thick envelopes she preferred for letters she never sent. Dawid stopped by one such window and rested his hand on the frame quietly. "This is where I saw your reflection once," he said. "You didn't know I was behind you? You were holding a book of Tuim and smiling." She didn't remember the moment, but she believed him. When they reached the bookstore, she opened the door and gestured for him to enter, not as a visitor, but as someone returning to a place he had always belonged. He stepped inside, hesitated for a beat, then walked to the counter as she moved behind it, her hands once again resting near the drawer where the bottle lay. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she pulled out a thin, sealed envelope, addressed simply in ink, for A, and placed it on the countertop. "I found it this morning," she said, "in the drawer next to the register." He looked at it, then at her, and said nothing. She smiled, just barely, and for the first time in decades, Alexandra felt the quiet weight in her chest begin to lift, not because everything had been resolved, not because the past had been rewritten, but because in this moment, with Dawid standing in the soft light of the place she had built around his absence, she was no longer waiting. In the weeks that followed, Dawid became part of the shop's rhythm, not as an employee nor quite as a guest, but as a presence so quietly constant that Alexandra began to feel time reassembling itself around him. He would arrive most mornings just after opening, place his coat carefully on the same hook near the door, and greet her not with words, but with a glance that felt both familiar and new. like a note in a song she'd forgotten she knew by heart. They did not speak often, nor did they need to. Their language had always been rooted in silences, the space between verses, the pause between turning pages, the way a breath could carry more than a sentence ever could. He shelved books with a care that mirrored her own, handled poetry volumes as if they were sacred, and occasionally pointed out an unfamiliar edition or a misfiled collection with a quiet amusement that never broke the stillness they shared. Sometimes they would sit together near the front window, teacups in hand, watching the rain smear the view of Charles Street until the world outside looked like a painting they didn't need to interpret. In those moments, Alexandra felt something rare and unexpected, not happiness exactly, but rest, a sense of having landed finally in a space untouched by the violence of loss. The bottle of Cologne remained in its drawer, unopened but no longer hidden. Its scent had long since faded, yet she no longer needed it to remember. It was enough to see him, to see the way he ran his thumb along the spine of a book before opening it, or how he smiled, slowly, quietly, when he came across a verse he hadn't read in decades. One morning, she found a letter tucked between 2 volumes of translated Polish poetry. The envelope was unsealed, her name written in ink, just A, the same way he had once labeled the notes he used to leave beneath her window in Warsaw. She unfolded it slowly, the paper worn soft from his hands, and began to read. "I'm no longer the boy you knew, and you are not the girl I loved in the alleyways of a city now held together by memory and ash. But the dreams have returned, not as they were, not young or wild or hungry, but quiet, persistent, still alive. I don't believe in destiny, but I believe in you. And if you will have it, I'd like to be part of what still grows, even now, among the ruins." She folded the letter again, not crying, not smiling, just holding it for a long while as the city stirred outside her window, as voices passed the shop's glass door, and as the world, for once, did not feel so far away. That afternoon, David arrived with a small stack of second-hand books, the corners worn, the covers creased. She met him at the door, took the books from his arms, and said for the first time since that first rediscovered scent, "Let's shelve them together. No declarations, no promises, just 2 people sorting poetry into order, side by side. Because sometimes the war doesn't take everything. Sometimes what remains, a look, a letter, a breath, is enough to begin again." We publish new videos every day, true stories that move, restore, and inspire.